So we're here with Councilor John Filion, who has been a councillor for a long time, since the 90s. What has been the biggest change that you've seen over the years in Toronto Council?
Oh, gee. Well, I mean, there was a huge change when we went from City of North York Council to the new amalgamated City of Toronto Council. The big change there is related to the bigness of it. Much less collegial atmosphere, and even since from between 97 and now, the formation of warring tribes and, you know, people fighting for leadership within the tribes, that's much more prevalent than it used to be.
Obviously with amalgamation there's a lot to handle and there's a lot to adapt to with growing population. How has your ward, what challenges has your ward faced because of amalgamation?
Oh, well, amalgamation has made it more difficult to respond to local issues at the same time that the local issues are becoming very large. So, for example, you know, the redevelopment in my area is massive, and it's harder to control that at a big city level because people aren't familiar with the area. There used to be one councillor who used to almost brag to me that he'd never passed through my ward and never intended to. And I'd be trying to explain some local issue to him and he'd say, not interested, don't care about your area. So it's difficult to explain a development issue to 45 people to get a vote through. It's difficult to explain a traffic problem or a parks problem or anything to that many people. So it sort of comes down to, do people like you or not? And if you're a kid in the class that people like, they'll kind of look at, oh, you know, I like him or he's on my side, I'll vote for his motion. And if not, maybe I won't. It's a very strange way of making decisions.
With that kind of culture, is there a lot of tension in City Hall between councillors? Is there? Yeah, at the moment, actually, it's the best it's been in years since we took away the mayor's powers. And to use a football analogy, which is kind of appropriate with the mayor, it's you have to run the play without a huddle or a quarterback, and either that or you have to just leave the ball where it is. So people have finally decided to, you know, let's try this on our own without a leader, and let's not fight over who might be leader next or whatever. Let's try to get something done. And it's actually working remarkably well. Would not work well long term, but for you know, for a year, for the last year of this term, is working well. It's been several years since the introduction of the A La Carte program. What has City Council learnt from that program's attempted introduction?
Well, I don't know what City Council's learned. What I learned is don't try to do something by yourself, and beware of the bureaucracy.
With the food trucks coming up, there were a lot of kind of bureaucratic issues with the A La Carte program, like the city producing its own stuff for the program and things like that. Do you think that knowledge of that and those kind of things not necessarily being a good thing for the city has gone into the thoughts of councillors in the food trucks decisions?
Oh yeah, I mean the way it's going now is very much shaped by what people perceive to be wrong with the A La Carte program. Of course, the reality of that and the public perception of it are two very different things.
Could you maybe tell us a bit about
what the reality of the A La Carte?
Well, the A La Carte program, the concept was to showcase fabulous food from around the world, where it got all, and the notion of having a function, it was supposed to be a functional cart designed by food vendors, and then there'd be somebody you could go to if you wanted one, and that turned into the purchasing department taking over the design of the cart, turning it into a request for proposal, which I wasn't allowed to have anything to do with, them accepting the only person who said, yeah, I'll build that cart, with specs designed by the health department, and the first anybody saw of these carts, including the people who were using them, was when 2 days before they were supposed to go out in the street selling food with them, and you find out that the carts are totally dysfunctional. Like that's one example of what went wrong with the thing. So it wasn't that the fundamental idea was bad, it's that a different chunk of the bureaucracy took over different components of it and just made it completely not workable.
With the food trucks coming in and you're being on the Board of Health, do you have any idea of how the city will try to regulate food trucks in terms of health and sanitation?
Well, theoretically the same as you would with a restaurant. They'll be inspected, and they have to have ways of keeping hot food hot and cold food cold, and they're going to be washing their hands and all that kind of stuff. So that's a good thing about food trucks, is they are kind of mini kitchens. So it's a lot easier to sell different types of food from a food truck than it is from a food cart.
Yeah. Is there a strategy for dealing with bed bugs in the city?
Not a good one. There's a kind of multi-departmental group that tries to work together, and we've been effective in halting the spread of bed bugs, which was about to get to the point where you could go to a movie and bring home bed bugs, or get on the subway and bring home bed bugs. Fortunately, it never got to that, so we've been able to contain the spread and confine it somewhat to mostly high-rise buildings, often unfortunately with people who are least equipped to deal with the problem due to financial reasons, health reasons, mental health reasons.
Going on that, for many low-income residents, it's very hard to access medical services. How can we better outreach to those residents?
Well, public health does an extraordinarily good job of trying to find all those people. So I would say that's like a huge part of the focus of public health. It's the main mandate is to help people not get ill, and when you're doing that, you look for who are the people most at risk of getting ill due to a variety of factors, and that's where you put your resources. So the Toronto Public Health very much puts a disproportionate amount of its resources deliberately into areas of low income, people with special needs, new immigrants not familiar with the healthcare system, etc., etc.
coming from being on the North York Board of Health and into Toronto, which has such a larger population, what kind of adjustments and lessons have you learned from that kind of switch?
That was a really smooth transition, actually. If I think of all the amalgamated departments, the one that really didn't change was public health. In fact, it may have been the only department where amalgamation was a good thing because, for example, you could bring in a smoking bylaw for the entire city, whereas before, you know, we tried to do one in North York and I tried to do one in Toronto, and then Scarborough didn't want to do one, and Etobicoke didn't want to do one, and you know, it became very difficult, and so it's actually the one department where I think amalgamation has made it more effective, and the type of people who go into public health, like your public health bureaucrats, are not like bureaucrats at all. They're real, you know, health advocates, and they, you know, they could all have been doctors making a lot more money doing something else, but have chosen that profession because they really believe in it. So it's both in, I found the same in North York as in the Toronto Public Health. They're just both great organizations doing a terrific job.
Like to be working with the program?
Sometimes they're very cooperative. Sometimes they just avoid you and dodge the issue. It depends who you're dealing with and what their orientation is. Usually they're looking for a way. You have to give them a way to help you out without setting a precedent somewhere else. So if you want funding for bed bugs, for example, they're worried, what if everybody in the province wants funding for bed bugs? We don't have that in our budget, so how do we give it to Toronto? So you have to give them a reason for why Toronto should get it, that you have to work with them to set up criteria that anybody else who met the criteria could get the same thing, but there's really nobody else who meets the criteria.
When the issue of supervised injection centers came up 2 years ago, you were one of the councillors who voted against the proposal. What is your reasoning behind voting against?
Pretty squeamish about it. I recognize the need for it in some instances. You know, in Vancouver, where they have a neighborhood that you have a concentration of addicts, for example, you have a place where addicts are hanging out anyway, then it makes sense to, you know, get them in and you know, increase their safety, and you know, that can't criticize that program. In Toronto, I'm not sure we have that kind of a concentration. If it would have to be done very carefully. I don't think you could just set up a centralized safe injection site and say, okay, all the addicts from across the city come here, descend on this part of the city. I certainly would be opposed to that. If it was the neighborhood I represent, I wouldn't be located in the neighborhood I represent, but you know, I have to think, if I wouldn't want it in my area, then would I want to stick it on somebody else? And you know, so I think maybe some, you know, if it was treated a different way, if you had a more spread out number of locations that were serving that community, and you sort of diffused the impact of it. I'm not necessarily opposed to the concept. I just I'm very uncomfortable with the establishing a centralized site in Toronto.
Going into, back to academics, in the off chance that we did have an epidemic in Toronto of, you know, any kind of virus, what kind of role would public health play in diffusing and managing that situation?
Well, public health is involved in planning for it and would play a role in coordinating the response, but probably not a large enough role. I think we got lucky with the last pandemic. It was extremely mild pandemic. If it had been a more serious one, I think we would have it would have been seen that we weren't all that prepared for it.
Do you think we would be prepared for one now, and how do you think we could be more prepared if it were to happen?
I think we would not be prepared for a very serious epidemic, like if you pandemic. We're prepared for like a mild to moderate one. If to prepare for a major one like a 1918 type epidemic, pandemic, you need to have the various governments and government agencies put resources into planning for something at that level, and they are extremely reluctant to do so. When I was chair prior to the last pandemic, I went on record publicly as saying we're not ready, we're not, the standard is, or the risk threshold is way too low here. If we have any kind of a serious pandemic, we're not ready for it.